people, I don't think anybody's going to be surprised if our government says, hey, we've got a craft from another world, because it is almost common knowledge. I don't think anyone's going to be surprised if they see a small 3.5 or 4 foot tall gray being, because they've been portrayed for so long in the media. Well, Elohim is a plural, which means it was more than one being, and there's a lot of controversy around this. So it appears that Moses received that gematria message, and I'll describe that in a moment, from one of the Elohim, one of the plural gods that are responsible for our existence. We are lost is that we are angels who have forgotten that they are angels. When we find the equivalent between the numbers that represent the elements, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and the numbers that represent the ancient alphabets. And I think what was so powerful for me at the time, Robert, was when we look at linguistics, the core alphabets are considered to be cuneiform, Sanskrit, Arabic, and Hebrew. And as different as they are from one another, the message encoded into our DNA reads exactly the same in each of those four core alphabets. In other words, it's such a universal message. And to me, that is also a message of hope and peace. When we think our differences are so great that we have to hurt one another to solve our problems, we need look no further than the DNA in the nucleus of the 50 trillion cells in every one of the 8+ billion people on the planet. The message is the same. And if our viewers have not seen it, the message, when we equate the letters of the ancient alphabets with the atomic mass of the elements that make our bodies, and we equate those numbers, they become interchangeable. And so when we put the letters in place of those elements, the message literally reads, and this isn't a metaphor and it's not a channeled message. It literally reads the words God eternal within the body. And the word God is the word that is spelled in those ancient texts. It doesn't say, where God comes from. Doesn't say
Yahweh.
how it happened. Well, it's abbreviation of Yahweh. It's YH.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, if you read further in the original
Yod
text.
Hey, I guess.
Well, if you read in the Hebrew text of Exodus, where Moses is receiving that code, if we're to believe that process happened historically the way that it's described, if you read further down, he actually asked for clarification in terms of, he said, who are you? Or who am I talking to? And the name given was Yah. Yah is actually was the personal name of, this is where it gets really interesting. Yah was the personal name of the being that revealed that text. However, previously, we're told that we are the product of Elohim, which is very controversial, because when the translators translated the biblical text into what we call the King James Version, for example, or others, they took the word Elohim and they wrote it as the word God. Well, Elohim is a plural, which means it was more than one being, and there's a lot of controversy around this. So it appears that Moses received that gematria message, and I'll describe that in a moment, from one of the Elohim, one of the plural gods that are responsible for our existence. And the way that the scholars now, and I've worked with some of the Hebrew scholars who have actually when the Bible code, the original Eli Rips just passed recently, and I'm in contact. There were three rabbis. I'm in contact with the other two, and there's a lot of information in the original Hebrew text that is lost in the translation. But it appears, and this comes back to number, that the way Moses received that information, it wasn't on two big granite slabs like Charlton Heston coming down, the mountain. But it was a continuous string of numbers, numeric information with no punctuation, and it wasn't on massive slabs. It was on a relatively small crystalline material that is not known in this world. And that is part of what is believed to be the mystery in the Ark. When we find there are many Ark of the Covenants in terms of copies. When we find, I think we already found it when it is actually revealed, the original Ark. I think this what we'll find is that the Torah is actually revealed in a relatively held in the palm of the hand, a small crystalline substance in number. Those numbers, when they are converted to their alpha equivalent, become what we read as the Torah.
And what do you believe is that crystalline substance?
You know, I don't know. I don't know for sure. It was given, if we're to believe the story as it's told in our biblical text, it was given to Moses. It could have been synthetic substance. It could be a natural material that doesn't occur on Earth, but it wasn't like something he just picked up out of the Sinai desert. And there's nothing there. I mean, it's not like there's a lot of blue stones lying around. There's no plants. There's no water. It's just you and the sky and the earth and God. And that substance, I think, when we actually, that will be part of disclosure. It all ties into the disclosure process in terms of who we are, where it is that we've come from, who are the Elohim. And now when you open the door to that question, you're talking about the Gilgamesh discovery of the Gilgamesh tomb. You're talking about all the Mesopotamian texts, Akkadian, Sumerian, Babylonian. You're talking about, much more than Area 51 and some craft and a hangar there. So I think that's one of the reasons for the delay in the disclosure. It's actually happening. I don't think anyone, most people, I don't think anybody's going to be surprised if our government says, hey, we've got a craft from another world, because it is almost common knowledge. I don't think anyone's going to be surprised if they see a small 3.5 or 4 foot tall, gray being, because they've been portrayed for so long in the media. But when it comes to what that means to us and our origins and who we are, where we come from, I think that is really, that's what's holding this whole thing up. The church is really pushing back on the disclosure of that kind of information.
But this message that was in the DNA, let's go back to that just for a moment. What did it say to you? I mean, what was the big aha for you when you found that the message was, and you could repeat it again, it was God is the eternal.
So the message, so just the context, it took me almost 15 years to figure this out. And the reason was I had to break those traditional barriers, cross those barriers. I knew that when it comes to the gematria, there was one letter and one number correspondence, no problem there. Now you look at the periodic table, and we're made of primarily of hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon. Robert, there are, as you know, there's a whole lot of numbers that can describe hydrogen. You've got atomic weight, atomic mass, valence, all kinds of things.
Sure.
And we didn't have computers on the desktop like we do today. So this was all done by hand. And at night, I would work. Most of my work happens between 11 at night and 3 in the morning. I'm a night person. And I would have a legal...
Me too, by the way.
Well, that's what my books are written. I would have a legal pad, and I was just going through by hand. There were no reference books for what I was doing, so I had to create my own reference books. And I still have handwritten notebooks of all the things. And it was about 2:30 in the morning, and I was literally sitting in my living room with my back against the couch. I wasn't even in the office, and I was on a table at 2:30 in the morning when that first message came through, and it literally came through the words "God, eternal within the body." And I thought, I won't even tell you what I actually said, but first thing I did, I actually called a statistician friend of mine, and I said, "Man, is this a fluke? Is this, what are the possibilities?" And he ran some numbers, 0.00043%, or 1 in 256,000 and something that it was a fluke. So it appears to be intentional. And
I thought you were going to say 0.00432, which would have been really funny because that is actually Euler to the power of pi.
wow, I hadn't thought about that. I
Yeah.
hadn't thought about that. Well, this was, I had them run the numbers, and then once he did that, I have to tell you, honestly, I felt differently about myself. And it could have been because it was 2:30 in the morning and I was, I was pretty toasted. But as a geologist, I believe in evolution for many forms of life. I've seen it in the fossil record, plants, animals, insects, but that theory, Darwin's theory, breaks down when it comes to humans. Something happened to us 200,000 years ago, and we can see it in the genetic record of the mutations that happened exactly at that time that cannot happen in nature. They cannot happen under natural conditions. So I would hope if who or whatever is responsible for our existence was proud of what was created, that they would have left a signature or they would have left a mark in the essence of our DNA. And that when we achieve a level of consciousness where we know where to look, we know how to look, and we have the technology that allows us to look, that we would see that message. So when I read, that's my personal belief system. So when I read the words God eternal within the body in the genetic sequence that I had, and it was a computer printout of a genetic sequence, to me, I felt differently about myself. Even though I knew that I'm not the product of lucky biology and random mutations, seeing it pop out in the DNA like that. And then I tried it again and again and again, different segments of DNA. What it looks like, Robert, the DNA is coded in layers. Just like a book has a preface and, a chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. And this part of the DNA, this is the top layer. It literally is the introduction to what comes next. So who are we? We're God eternal within the body. The instructions that taught me how to do this, I derived from a 3,000-year-old text called the Sefer Yetzirah, which is it's a mysterious text. It's only about 1,000 lines long. It's only been translated once into English by a man who passed not long ago. His name was Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. And what a brilliant brother. And it is so mysterious that many rabbis won't even teach. They'll teach the Midrash and they'll teach the Zohar. But when it comes to the Sefer Yetzirah, it's so mysterious, they don't even teach it. And I said, man, there's a book that's so mysterious they don't want to teach. I
got to read that one.
Yeah, bring it on. So I procured a copy back in the 90s, and it's not an easy read, and it is all about gematria. And following those instructions, I said, what if I equate these instructions that are 3,000 years old with the best science of the modern world? And that told me what order and how to go about making those connections. So when we treat the periodic table with the rules of gematria and we treat the ancient alphabets with the rules of the periodic table, it breaks down to the numeric sequence 1563. And 1563, when we link that then to the Hebrew alphabet, that's where those letters come from. Now, the Y is actually the letter 10 in the Hebrew alphabet, but gematria says, there's so many moving parts of this. Let me just step back. Gematria is a science because it was defined by 32 rabbinical rules that were laid down in the 2nd century. Numerology is a loose subset that is not a science because it doesn't conform to the rules. So this is not numerology, it is gematria. And there are very specific rules in gematria. And one of those rules says that a number can be reduced to what is called a Pythagorean number or an angelic number between 0 and 9. When we apply that to the periodic table, and we apply that to the ancient alphabet. So the Y in the Hebrew gematria is a 10. 1 plus 0 is 1. So that becomes the 1, 5, 6, 5. And, we spell this out pretty clear. I have a new book called Pure Human. It is pushing back on the transhuman movement, and chapter 2 describes the whole process that we're talking about right now. For anybody that wants to follow that process, it literally is, anybody can do it. You can do it on a napkin at your family holiday gathering and impress your friends and neighbors if you want. But what it means, the meaning and the implications are so profound, Robert. And it changed my life at that time and led me to even further pursue. I mean, there were other facets of my exploration. The Shroud of Turin, for example. Is that an authentic shroud of a man who was described 2,000 years ago, of Jesus, of being crucified? I was gifted in 1996 63 of the original slides from the photographer that documented the examination, the first examination of that shroud, and all the scientific categories. What it says, there is nothing in the shroud that prevents it from being the burial shroud of Jesus. The age, there is DNA, there is blood, it's AB positive. The man we know was about 5'7". He weighed 178 pounds. I mean, there's all kinds of information we can get from this. So when I'm reading God eternal within the body and then putting that in the context, not a religious context, but again, this is a Gnostic, from the Gnostic. Gnostic means gnosis, it means knowing. As we begin to have a deeper knowing of who we are, not from a religious perspective, historically, there was a man named Jesus, and according to the Gnostic text, he originated in a realm beyond the heaven of the Old Testament. That was the heresy in the book, the Gospel of John. Jesus' father, according to the Gnostics, his father was not the father in the Old Testament. His father was a greater, a higher principle, a deeper truth, a pure light is the way it's described. And finding a message in our DNA that is the same message that we find in the Shroud of Turin. So now you begin to make those links about who we are and what our potential is.
I did some analysis myself on DNA and on the periodic table of elements, and I came at it from a totally different perspective, but came away with a similar conclusion, I would say. And the way I looked at it was, I thought, what would be nature's counting system? And I thought immediately, well, it should be number of protons or number of electrons, right? Especially when we're talking about stable elements, and you have an equal number in that situation. And so, especially with all that makes up, the elements that make up the DNA, which is, predominantly just hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen, and sulfur. And basically, as I started looking at this, I started thinking, okay, well, if I take all of this and take the approach of a digital root in mathematics, which is what you actually just referenced when you talked about numbers between 0 and 9, and then I applied that to adding up all of the number of protons, when you combine all of them in the adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine pairings, what I found was that in all cases, they add up to a digital root that comes out to 9, which was fascinating because we see this with prime number theory as well. And prime numbers will always have reciprocal values. So 1 over the prime number, if it's larger than the number 7 and all the way out into the number series, will always have reciprocal values that add up to a period value, a reciprocal period or periodicity, which will always add up to a sum of 9 as well. And so I found that kind of fascinating. And then what I found was that when you have the adenine thymine pairing, and 9 could be synonymous with 0 because 9 takes the position of 0 as well, as you likely know. When you replace thymine with uracil, then all of a sudden it creates an offset of ones. So now you have ones and zeros.
Yep.
And it basically is acting like a binary code that then is determining, with the combination of those things, it determines all protein synthesis. And then what type of proteins, what type of codon pairings you're going to have, and then that extends to amino acids, and then from amino acids off to protein synthesis. And I was like, wow, this is clearly something that has been deliberately created. And when I go back to the fine structure constant, which I know you're probably very well familiar with, which is the 137 and 1 over 137, and the sarcophagus fits in the king's chamber 137 times, which is always something interesting to me. But I also noticed that the Hebrew word for God, Yahweh, Yod-He Vav-He, could also be seen, and I look at geometry as resonant shapes. So every shape has a meaning and has a certain resonance, right? Just like looking at your wall behind you with all the cool, geometric patterns based on triangles and right triangles, that even Yod-He Vav-He has a certain shape resonance associated with it as well. And I thought, well, what other mathematical notation would look like this? And of course, it's pi to the 7th power on the right side and pi times 7 on the left side. And because the hey looks like pi, and the yod looks like a 7, but a small 7, like a 7th power, and vav looks like 7, but a normal 7. And lo and behold, shock of shocks, when you take pi times 7 and divide it by pi to the 7th power, that reduces down to 1 over 137.
This is it. And this is where it gets really interesting, because during the Cold War, the governments were at war, but scientists were still cooperating. It was a very civilized kind of a war. And Russian scientists were the first that began to look at the human body from an IT perspective. They started looking at cells as circuits, and they were looking at mitochondria as capacitors and resistors and transistors. And that has led to a very, very different way of thinking about the human body. In the journal Soft Computing, Proceedings from the Conference of Soft Computing, they literally stated that human DNA is a fractal antenna. So what that means is the DNA, an antenna tunes to a signal, fractal antenna tunes to many signals across a broad spectrum of information. So mathematically, what we're talking about is the ability because we can consciously change the morphology of our DNA. We can consciously thought, feeling, emotion, belief, breath, epigenetic triggers change the morphology. We're changing what our fractal antenna is accessing. And that is the link to consciousness right there. I think that's what we're talking about.
Spent a lot of time also working with my friend and colleague, Alan Green, on gematria type codes that were found in the King James Version of the Bible. And, the people that wrote the Bible were the same people, we believe, that, posed as Shakespeare. And basically, the whole Bible, the King James Version, is literally encoded with encryptions. And a lot of this is so fascinating, because what it says to us is almost like what we see on the surface of the world is one paradigm. Unless you actually go into this place of pure intention, which I think is what you did in trying to understand, where you picked out, the Sefer Yetzirah, and you basically said, I want to go for this, the most esoteric text. I want to understand what the mysteries are in this. And that these encryptions that are at the next level down, or the deeper introspection requirement, is actually there so that it can be found. It's not hidden so that it will never be found. It's there so that it can be found by the initiate, who is really looking introspectively and wanting to understand the mysteries.
They recently, the Jesuit branch of the Catholic Church, the science branch, amended their policy on life beyond the world, and the languaging. I didn't know we were going to have this conversation, so I'm going to do this from memory. But the languaging was very interesting. They said, we believe it is not counter to Catholic doctrine for there to be life beyond this world. So they open the door to accepting it if the
Yeah.
need comes. Prior to that, in other words, is the God of the earth the God of all the universe, or is there life, other life that may have, is it subject to the same God? And it's going to open up the door to a lot of really interesting questions.
Have you ever been to the Vatican Library?
I have been once to the library. My understanding is it's much bigger probably than what I was allowed to see. So I have not seen it in its entirety. I was seeing what we were allowed to see, publicly. And I think that will have to be part of disclosure, because many of the artifacts that we're talking about that link us to civilizations beyond this world are ancient, and those have been held in the Vatican archives, as well as the texts. For years I've done a very deep dive into the Gnostic texts and that were disavowed by the early councils of the church. There was one in the Council of Nicaea many people have heard about. There was another council, the Council of Carthage, and Carthage is the one that disavowed some of the most dangerous texts, such as the Gospel, the first and second Gospel of John, where John.
What was the date? I'm not familiar with I know the Nicene Creed and the Council of Nicaea
it was also
very well.
Yeah, it was in the 4th century as well, but it was later in the 4th century. And I mention that because most people aren't familiar with that. They think there was only one council. There were multiple councils, and the Council of Carthage really, I think, was the nail that sealed the narrative that we have today, because there were multiple documents, and I'm not saying every one of these is absolutely true, but the Gospel of John, for example, is fascinating because it is said to be written by John, who was the apostle. He received the gospel after the crucifixion from the resurrected Jesus, or Yeshua. Jesus is what it is in the translation, but it's Yeshua. So he received that, and it begins with the history of the universe, very similar to the Book of Enoch. And it begins with the history of humankind and how humankind was created. And it essentially says we are a hybrid species. We are the flesh and the bone of this world, imbued with an essence that gives us godlike powers that were sealed and kept from us. And I think this is really important, because we're now in modern world. You say, well, these are old stories. In the modern world, we're at this pivotal point in the transhuman movement, where we're being asked in a single generation to turn our biology over to technology, to relinquish our biology to AI, computer chips in the brain, chemicals in the blood, RFID chips under the skin, and more. And once we do that, what happens is our natural biology begins to atrophy, and we lose the very essence of our humanness, including the dormant potentials that open the door to these extraordinary abilities that we're only beginning to understand. So if you are to believe the Gnostic texts, it's a big story, probably more than I can do justice to here, but essentially what they say, Robert, is that we are lost, is that we are angels who have forgotten that they are angels. The Essenes actually say the only difference between the angels in the heavens and the angels that walk the earth is that the angels in the heavens remember that they're angels. The Gnostic texts say that when the rebellion happened in another world long before we got here, that our essence was deceived and brought to this world and trapped in this world in the sensual physicality of our bodies. And it's through those dormant potentials that we have the opportunity to redeem ourselves and return to our true home. If we give our bodies away to technology, we lose the ability to return to our true home. We are captive in this world forever, according to those Gnostic texts. these are the texts that were disavowed in the Carthage Council, and among the most heretical is the Gospel of Philip, for that reason and a lot of other reasons. So.